Hi, everyone. We've set up this Being an Engineer podcast as an industry knowledge repository, if you will. We hope it'll be a tool where engineers can learn about and connect with other companies, technologies, people, resources, and opportunities. So make some connections and enjoy the show.
We're going to be providing sight to the blind through implants. We're going to give the ability to control the environment to para and quadriplegics. We're going to see incredible new therapies like microbots that can move around the body to deliver various therapies. And I know some of this stuff sounds like science fiction, but folks are working on this stuff. And there's good reason to think we're going to be successful.
Hello and welcome to another wonderful episode of the Being an Engineer podcast. We're speaking with Mark Wehde today, who is the chair of the Mayo Clinic Division of Engineering, assistant professor of Biomedical Engineering in the Mayo Clinic College of Medicine and Science, fellow in the Mayo Clinic Academy of Educational Excellence, and associate lecturer for the University of Wisconsin MBA Consortium program. He is also the executive leader of a team of engineers, software developers, and project managers, providing development and integration of technology solutions across the Mayo Clinic. Mark, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. I'm glad to be here and looking forward to our conversation.
I have been as well. All right. We'll start off with a question that I ask everyone at the beginning of this podcast, which is, what made you decide to become an engineer?
Well, I'm not surprised that's your first question. That's one of those questions that gets asked over and over. And really, I think there seems to be a common theme among engineers, and that's a love of math and science. I loved math and science in high school, and engineering just seemed to make sense. I didn't really know enough about engineering in high school to really think about making things and some of the things that I really came to love about engineers. And, that's what engineers do. We solve problems and we make stuff. But what I did know is I was good at math and science. I knew engineering paid a decent wage, and I knew there were jobs available. So not too exciting a reason maybe, but I'd have to say it worked out pretty good in the long run.
Yeah, sounds like a pretty common tale across different engineers. Yeah. Well, I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey from a development engineer through your current role as chair of the engineering division. Was this path always the plan for you, and kind of what decisions or behaviors along the way facilitated your career path?
Yeah, well, I really believe in serendipity. So in many ways, our career appears in front of us, and we just have to take the path. But I did have some leadership experience in high school and college. So when I started at Mayo, I remember thinking, when I started there, someday maybe I'll be chair. That would be really cool.
Oh, interesting.
But I promptly fell in love with my work, and I actually forgot about that for the next 16 years. It turned out that I loved solving problems with technology, and I especially loved exploring new technologies, and I just got hooked. But about 16 years in, there was an opportunity to move into a first-line management position. I hadn't really thought about it seriously before, but at that point, after having some serious internal conversations with myself, I decided to take the plunge, and I became manager of a group of engineers and project managers. And then after that, I started a series of lateral moves. And I think lateral moves are really an underappreciated way to learn an organization, and also to move into kind of a different career trajectory. So I first moved into a first line position with our mechanical engineering team and machine shop. And then after a couple of years, another lateral move to our electronic groups. And then I just kind of sat there for a bit, really just developing skills. And then it was probably almost 9 years later when I moved into a second line position with our electronics and software development team. And then another 4 years later before I moved into the chair position. And I really think that moving around the organization helped me a lot. When I was managing our mechanical engineering team, I was all of a sudden not the expert, and I learned a whole lot about trusting the team. I think for those of us who come out with a real love of technology, when we move into that first management position, they move us into that position because we were pretty good technically. So we're probably one of the stronger developers. So we have this sense we know maybe better than our staff what they should be doing, and maybe in some cases we do, and we forget that that's no longer our job. So moving to the mechanical team, I didn't have any choice but to let the engineers do the engineering. And I started then really learning the soft skills around leadership.
And your degree is in electrical engineering,
yeah,
right?
my degree is electrical and biomedical, so no background in mechanical engineering. Although I did enough work with mechanical engineers that at one point when I was doing technology work, I decided I needed a machining certificate so that I understood that side of the house a little bit better as well. And if I were to do something different, boy, I don't know. I kind of like where I ended up. Had I moved into a management role sooner, I probably could have gone further in my career. But I'm really happy where I'm at right now. So I think it worked out for me.
That's excellent. You mentioned having some serious conversations with yourself when deciding to move into that leadership role. I think that's a really underappreciated skill. This ability to reflect and have those deep conversations with yourself. Is there anything in particular that you do to help put yourself on the right state of mind that you can share with the audience?
Well, I think it's really important to think about your motivations and perhaps separate your ego from it a little bit so that you're not taking positions just because you think you should, or because that's the natural progression, or because you want to be perceived as a leader. So I think that's an important part of it, is really understanding your motivations. And then I think you have to think a little bit about how you identify too, because many of us as engineers really identify as engineers, right? That's kind of who we are and how we see ourselves. And what I have found is I've moved into a management role. The longer I've been in management roles and the higher up the organization I've gone, the more I've lost my identity as an engineer, and I now see myself more as a leader and emphasize those business skills as opposed to the engineering skills. But you never leave that behind. You're always an engineer. You always have that mindset around problem solving that is incredibly valuable in the leadership of organizations.
It's funny that you say you feel like you've lost your identity as an engineer, because I've experienced the same thing. It's kind of scary in a way. You stop doing the nitty-gritty engineering work and you're focused more on whatever it is, business development or soft skills or developing people, leadership. And at some point, several years into that journey myself, I realized, I haven't done a whole lot of engineering lately. I think I'm pretty rusty. What happens if my company explodes and I need to go out and find a job? I don't. It's it was an interesting headspace to be in that I had not considered before. That part of my journey started.
I keep reminding myself, I did it once. If I need to relearn the skills of a technologist, I can still do that. I still have the love and the passion for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, before we met, I wasn't even aware that the Mayo Clinic had a division of engineering. Can you tell us a little bit about what your division does? Is it mostly like medical device development, but embedded within Mayo? Yeah.
So our engineering team has been at Mayo for a little over 107 years now.
Wow.
So aseptic surgery and anesthesia were first introduced in the United States in the late 1800s, and that really led to an explosion in the development of new surgical tools. And a hallmark of the Mayo practice has always been around innovation. And in order to meet the growing demand for new types of surgical instruments, in 1915, the Mayo brothers formed what they called the Instrument Shop. And this centralized the development and repair of surgical instruments. There were dozens and dozens of custom instruments that were created in the next 10 or 20 years, many of which were made widely available around the world. And our team still does custom surgical tool development. We've got a machine shop that supports the entire organization. And then layered on top of that now is a development team that's focused on developing new devices, especially on helping our physicians and healthcare professionals innovate. We've got a quality management system. We understand medical regulations. We've got a robust safety risk management process, but we aren't a medical device manufacturer. We don't sell and market anything that we make. What we do is we make devices that either go directly into use, supporting our research or our clinical trials or our clinical practice, or a whole lot of what we do supports innovation through prototypes that then may be licensed to medical device companies to actually mature them.
Well, yet another reason why the Mayo Clinic is such a prestigious organization. They have their own engineering department right there to make custom devices.
Yeah, it's a pretty unique resource. We tried to do some benchmarking a few years ago and reached out to some of the other major academic healthcare organizations looking for a group that was similar to ours, and we simply couldn't find one. They all have engineering capabilities, engineering resources, but they're normally in conjunction with a university or something like that, part of a research program. We're a dedicated, applied engineering group of about 70 folks that simply is there to make and deliver devices. We're not a research group. We don't do grant-funded work. We're not publishing and writing papers for the most part. We're simply there to innovate, to create new and novel devices. So it's really a fun place to be.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. That's a good-sized group too, 70 people. You can do some damage with that.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
On your LinkedIn page, you have a banner that says "Discomfort is the price of admission to a meaningful life." I thought that was so interesting. Can you talk a little bit about that, and if you have one, maybe share an example from your life that illustrates that philosophy?
Yeah, well, I think it's exciting to be on the front end of massively disruptive technologies. I think every generation has its opportunity, and there's a special joy in trying to do something nobody else has ever done. But it's also easy to get complacent, to stop taking chances, to keep doing what you know. But it's hard to get meaning out of that. And I think Mayo is great because for more than 150 years, we've been constantly learning, constantly improving, constantly changing. And that's risky, and sometimes it's really, really hard. And on top of that, I think personal growth involves a lot of discomfort. We've got to struggle with our own demons, with our own weaknesses in order to grow. And I'm not the person that walked into Mayo Clinic in July of 1984, not even close. And I also, if you think about some examples, and this isn't really technology related, but I think it's so important to our field, our STEM field, is some of the work that I've done supporting diversity and inclusion. I'm a Midwestern boy. I'm part of the patriarchy, and I'm trying to educate people like me who don't see the harm the system has caused. And that can be a really uncomfortable journey, but it's an incredibly meaningful space to be working in.
Yeah, excellent, wonderful. Well, I guess speaking of inclusion, that I think the intent for that discussion is to ultimately end up in a place of joy. And I read an article that you wrote in which you shared a message from your CEO about joy. And I was hoping you could share a little bit about what it's like working at the Mayo Clinic, and how is this message of joy represented in the day-to-day work there?
Yeah, and that article that you were referring to was something that I wrote a few months into the pandemic when we had started working remotely, and I had gone back into work one day because I'm normally working remotely, and I had forgotten the connection that you have to the patients when you are on site, when you are walking through the hallways, because we're all of us as Mayo staff, we're surrounded by patients when we're there, and it reminds us of what we're doing and why we're there. And I have to say, healthcare workers are suffering from burnout at a high rate even before the pandemic, and now it's even worse. And it's so incredibly important that we focus on building resiliency in our staff. And it's clear that folks find meaning and purpose. People that find meaning and purpose in their works are just more resilient and they're more joyful. And if there's a field where meaning and purpose is just baked into it, it's got to be healthcare. So this is really important to us. Our leaders talk about it all the time. We've got work groups and committees that help with employee well-being and joy. It's part of the message that our leaders share with us, starting at the very top. Our biggest joy promoter is our CEO, Dr. Gianrico Ferrugia. It's one of the messages that he shares with us on a regular basis. And this plays out in how we interact with each other. We ask our leaders to be true servant leaders and support their staff, and we see results in incredibly low turnover rates and high staff satisfaction scores, and especially in the scores that our supervisors receive. And we hear this expression, people don't leave organizations, they leave managers. And I think that's part of why Mayo has such a low turnover too.
Well, that was the next question I was going to ask you about. Is you've been there for quite some time. What has Mayo done to deserve such devotion?
It does verge on devotion at time. And I think when you work at an organization like Mayo Clinic, discussion of our values, the values of the Mayo brothers are just everywhere. You'll find very few people who can't immediately recite our primary value. Our primary value is the needs of the patient come first. You could ask 70,000 of our employees and probably 69,900 would get it right. How many organizations, every single employee knows their primary value, right? I think that's a bit unique. So needs of the patient come first. And then layered on top of that, the curiosity of our founders continues to impact us today. Will and Charlie Mayo started the Mayo Clinic back in 1889, and they're special to us because they're associated with our best traditions of caring for others. And they've led us to a place that really exists in our mind. It's a place where we work for the betterment of humanity, and that makes us better because of it. And there aren't many other places where you can find that. And then think about it. Year after year, we're ranked as the best hospital, the best healthcare system in the world. We're like the 1991 to 1998 Chicago Bulls, only in a world where Michael Jordan didn't leave for 2 years, right? Just top of our game year in and year out. And the difference is we don't depend on superstars like Michael Jordan necessarily. We depend on the system, right? The system sustains itself.
Yeah, a friend of mine had an ailment, and it was fairly serious in nature. And he had visited several clinics and spoken with different groups, and he really wasn't getting anywhere. And then finally, he approached Mayo, and I remember him saying it was definitely more expensive than the other places. But once he got there, they had an entire schedule already planned out, different experts that were planning to meet with him, and he said that the experience start to finish, and he was there for several days. I think it was 2 or 3 days, but he said the experience start to finish was just, it was mind-blowing. It was so efficient and well organized and effective. He actually did get a resolution to this condition of his, and I mean that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, well, I think the fact that we can solve very complex medical problems, very, very complex multi-system kinds of issues is, of course, one of the hallmarks. But what you're referring to also is the patient experience. And that's an incredibly important part of what we do for our patients. When you walk in the doors, you're inspired. It's a beautiful facility. And the reason it's like that is because people walk into that and they have hope. Right? They look around and say, these folks know what they're doing. And then when you look at the way we schedule our visits, if you're coming in from away, our intent is to get you to appointment as quick as we can. My mother-in-law was diagnosed with breast cancer in New Jersey a couple of years ago. And so, she would set up an appointment with her primary care. Her primary care physician would send her to a specialist, who would then send her to a radiologist, and it was like 3-4 weeks between each of these, and then, eventually circle back around. That doesn't happen at Mayo. It's that all happens in a week, right? While you're there visiting. If we look at you today and say you need an X-ray, you've got your appointment in an hour, and you're next up getting your X-ray. So very, very efficient system, and it's amazing given that we have over 1 million patients a year coming through our facility.
Yeah, that really is amazing. I mean, I've luckily, knock on wood, haven't had any serious medical trouble yet, but just, the standard run-of-the-mill stuff, I know how frustrating it can be having to go to a doctor to primary care and then get referred to the specialist and then go to a lab to get my blood drawn, and it just takes so much time. I'd much rather, pay the extra money and just get it all taken care of once. But
yeah, this was an innovation that actually Dr. Henry Plummer, one of our early physicians, created. We had a custom patient record. Historically, physicians would keep their own records on the patient. There wasn't one centralized place for a patient record. But that was one of the innovations of Dr. Plummer, was creating an integrated record, and that record would travel with the patient. So if you come down to Mayo, before there were electronic medical records, there were tube systems and there were drops where you could drop the records floor to floor, because the goal was always to get the record to the next physician before the patient could get there.
Oh,
so
that's great.
It was fascinating. So the medical record was invented by Henry Plummer.
How cool. Okay. I have a question about the pandemic. Now, working at Mayo, even though you weren't physically there during, I imagine, a lot of it, because your team was probably working remotely, but you were, kind of there and involved in everything that was happening. How did the pandemic change the day-to-day work at the Mayo? And do you have any experiences that you could share about that?
Yeah, so some of our team was remote, but a lot of them, were in person. Our machinists, we couldn't move our CNC machines home, for example. So as you can imagine, at the start of the pandemic, things were a little bit surreal. Most of the engineering team, the engineers at least, did transition to remote work within about a week. And within 3 weeks, we were putting all of our projects on hold to start addressing supply chain issues, and we had to start becoming aerosol science experts. So our team got busy reverse engineering and fabricating parts that we couldn't make, couldn't order through our supply chain. We made 20,000 face shields. We made thousands of parts for respirators and nebulizers. We also started studying air clearance in our operating and procedure rooms, because we knew we had an airborne virus, and we had to figure out how long our operating and procedure rooms needed to clear before we could bring the next patients in. And along the way, we learned we could seriously scale back some of our processes and get rid of some administrative burden and still get a high quality outcome. And that was a lesson we took with us as things went back to normal. And then during that, we also learned how to work remotely effectively with our colleagues, and that allowed us from our Rochester base to start working with our colleagues in Florida and Arizona. And so over the last couple years, we've also really developed as a true enterprise-wide resource. So a lot of learnings that the engineering team is taking out of this experience.
Yeah, that's tremendous. I know that we've learned that it's Pipeline is actually kind of unique in this sense, because we always worked from home ever since the company started. And so as people were moving out of offices and going home at the start of the pandemic, we actually moved into our first commercial space. And so we were, always working remotely, and then now we're here in person, and we've found a really nice mix between the two. Kind of a hybrid situation has worked out super well for us. I imagine that's the case for a lot of groups out there.
Yeah, for most of our team now has migrated to a hybrid. They go in when they need to work on stuff. They work on it at home when they can. The management team, like myself, has stayed mostly remote, because most of the work that we're doing is communicating or exchanging information, which we can do quite fine in this virtual world. But certainly our engineering teams are now about 50-50, and some 100% on site.
Yeah, our core value number 2 here at Pipeline is governed by productivity, not bureaucracy. And so I just tell people, work
Awesome.
wherever you're most productive,
Yep.
Yeah, you and your team. Well, let me take just a very short pause here and share with the listeners that teampipeline.us is where you can learn more about how we help medical device and other product engineering or manufacturing teams develop turnkey equipment, custom fixtures, and automated machines to characterize, inspect, assemble, manufacture, and perform verification testing on your devices. And we're speaking with Mark Wehde today. Mark, one of the areas that you're pretty familiar with is the emerging field of remote healthcare. How has the pandemic affected this, and like what can we expect to see developed in remote healthcare over the next several years?
Yeah, so our direction hasn't changed. We know that remote healthcare is a big part of the future, and even before the pandemic, it was one of the core components of what we call our bold forward 2030 strategic plan. So definitely was the direction we were headed. But the pandemic did a few different things. First, it convinced us as healthcare providers that we could provide a lot of great healthcare remotely, even with today's technology. And then it also resulted in the relaxation of some of the regulatory hurdles that were probably going to take years to revise. So, for example, prior to the pandemic, a physician in Rochester, Minnesota, couldn't have a remote visit with a patient 70 miles away in La Crosse, Wisconsin, without being licensed in both states. So, that was an example of one of the rules that was relaxed, and it would have been an impediment to providing effective remote care. It also convinced us that remote care can work. I've personally had several remote visits. I go in if I need to, but much of what most of us need doesn't require that in-person visit. So I avoid a long trek to the clinic, the parking issues, waiting in the waiting room. It's just so much more customer friendly. And then we know remote care won't be going away. And in fact, over the future, it's going to become even more device-centric so that we can do more and more things remotely. And not only in the home, we're also seeing technology that allows us to move remote care from the large academic healthcare organizations like our Rochester facility out to community hospitals and rural locations. And I think that's a huge advantage of being able to provide remote care.
How big of a role do you think some of these consumer medical devices will play in remote healthcare? For example, like the Aura Ring, right, where it's tracking different biometrics. Do you think that's going to become more widely accepted, or are there going to have to be much more dedicated, like I don't know, more commercial grade type products that people use remotely?
Yeah, I mean, I think the medical device space is highly regulated, and part of that is ensuring the quality of the data. And a lot of these consumer grade devices, it doesn't matter if it's not really tracking your heart rate for a while. That has no implications. But if you're trying to diagnose or treat, provide therapy for something, that doesn't work. And so I think it's interesting because we've seen a huge explosion in consumer wearables over the last 10 years, right? Everybody's got one. I've got my iWatch. Everybody's got their Fitbits, whatever it might be. And now we're starting to see that transitioning to medical devices, but it's not an easy move. And part of the problem is these companies working in that consumer wearable space don't understand the medical device world, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of learning that has to go on. They've got to understand the regulatory requirements. And it's not that you can't do agile development and stuff like that, but you can't drop new code once a day, once a week. You just can't do that because it has to be verified and validated before you can do that. So there's just a lot of constraints around it. I think overall they're simply going to have to learn to work in a more regulated space. Quality of data is going to be much more important. Or being able to identify when you have quality data and when you don't, because you don't necessarily need continuous data either. So, many ways of dealing with it.
That makes sense. Well, you spent 16 years, kind of boots on the ground engineering, and since then it's been more leadership roles. But especially during those first 16 years, and maybe now as well, what have been a few of the most effective ways that you've found to learn new technical knowledge?
Yeah, well, I mean, learning is learning. So whether I'm learning technical knowledge to solve a problem, or whether I'm trying to learn leadership skills, I really approach it the same way. And I know everyone probably has their own style. Some folks just dive in, some study on their own, some learn from courses and conferences. I tend to use all of these styles simultaneously. So self-study and then application. Incredibly important that you're applying the stuff that you're learning. And I combine that with formal education too. I really don't like to learn something without being able to apply it. And I think that's just the engineer in me. But I like to learn how to do it right. And so I turn to formal education and books and things like that to help do that. I also don't want to solve a problem that somebody else has already solved, right? So I like to find solutions that already exist and be able to take those and build on them and make them my own. And then in technology fields, much of what you're learning is pretty new. So you got to be pretty aggressive sometimes at finding sources of information. Historically, when I was an engineer, that was trade magazines because things always showed up there first. But nowadays, you got to be really good at finding things on the internet. That's where all the new stuff is.
Yeah. I'm a big fan of the mantra, doing is better than learning about doing. And there's a lot of book knowledge I learned in school, but sadly, I remember very little of that. It's the things that you actually do that you end up, A, learning really well, and B, remembering. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Well, if you weren't working at the Mayo Clinic, where else do you think you could be happy professionally?
Yeah, so I've been fortunate while working at Mayo to have the opportunity also to do some teaching and within Mayo, and I've leveraged that into a couple of adjunct teaching roles at the University of Wisconsin MBA Consortium, at the University of Minnesota Technology Leader Institute. So I'd say teaching either engineering or leadership at a university might be my next choice, which kind of makes sense because I'm sort of doing that right now on a part-time basis. That said, if I were going to start my career anew right now, I'd be awful interested in the AI and the XR fields. Mostly because those technologies are so cool and they're really complex, and I like doing things that are hard.
Yeah. Well, now, I'm certainly familiar with AI, but XR, I'm not sure I know what that is.
XR is just augmented virtual AR, VR.
I see. I got it. Okay, cool.
So XR is extended reality.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that. Well, that is probably a good segue into this next question, which is what tools do you think that we'll see over the next 5 to 10 years from the medical device space?
Yeah, well, I think we're going to see a lot more wearables and implantables. I think these devices are going to be communicating with each other. We're going to have these body networks as well as communicating with the cloud. I also truly hope that we figure out how to bring basic preventive care to everyone. So much of that can be managed through telemedicine. Atul Gawande once wrote that the single biggest thing we can do to improve healthcare in the U.S. is to make preventive care available to everyone. So I hope we can use these new tools really to reduce disparities in care. And then I think we'll see a lot more complex care done in home. There's already entirely virtual hospital models like Mercy Virtual in St. Louis. So it's an entirely virtual hospital. They don't have any hospital beds. All the equipment is taken to the patient's homes. And I expect to see more and more of this. And there's some great technologies out there. I expect us to see, we're going to be providing sight to the blind through implants. We're going to give the ability to control the environment to para and quadriplegics. We're going to see incredible new therapies like microbots that can move around the body to deliver various therapies. And I know some of this stuff sounds like science fiction, but folks are working on this stuff. And there's good reason to think we're going to be successful. And then AI is going to make huge changes in our ability to diagnose and treat various diseases. And these XR technologies are going to change how we educate our next generation of physicians and healthcare providers. And I really feel like we've reached a tipping point. We're seeing advances in a lot of synergistic technologies simultaneously, and I truly expect just to see amazing things over the next decade. I mean, the rate of change is just exponential.
Makes me feel very grateful to be alive at this time.
Yeah. It's for somebody who loves technology, things are really happening.
Well, just listening to you talk is very inspiring, and I'm getting excited, just listening to some of the things that you're mentioning. I imagine that other people listening to this episode are going to feel the same way. For those engineers out there who are listening to this and thinking, that sounds really cool, maybe they're not in the medical space right now, but they're considering a change. What things should they consider that might affect their decision to whether they move into the medical device space, the bioengineering space?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty easy answer. Technology is fun in any field. It's just a great space to be working in, but doing something that helps people is a really strong draw for folks that are working in healthcare and the medical device space. It's still work, still a job, but there's really some intrinsic rewards that go beyond the fun of playing with cool technology. So I think that's the biggest draw for people looking to go into the medical device or the bioengineering space.
Yeah, well said. All right. Well, Mark, I think we're about to the end of the questions I wanted to ask you. Is there anything else that we haven't talked about that we should?
I think we've covered a lot of ground from
okay
from college all the way to today. So,
all right, excellent. Well, Mark, how can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, folks can find me on LinkedIn, and I assume if you're listening to this podcast, it probably has my name associated with it. So if you just search on my name, you should be able to find it. I think I'm probably the only one out there in LinkedIn. So
perfect. All right. And what about folks who might be listening to this thinking, Mayo Clinic, that's where I want to work as an engineer. What's the path to getting there? What should they consider?
Yeah, so great idea. So first, I'm always happy to chat with folks that are interested in the medical device space. So if they reach out over LinkedIn, I'm happy to visit with them. Mayo does have, like most organizations, a job board where you can see what kind of jobs are available. So there's a lot of engineering jobs at Mayo. Of course, the engineering team that I represent is one, but we have a very large biomedical engineering department in our research shield. So they hire a lot of PhD students and postdocs with engineering degrees. There's also a couple other small pockets of engineering at Mayo as well. So makes sense to keep an eye on the job board, but also reach out to me if you want some specific advice.
Terrific. Well, Mark, thank you again so much for joining me today. It's really been a pleasure getting to talk with you and hear a little bit about your story, your journey. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for the opportunity, and I love encouraging and hopefully providing some enthusiasm for the next generation of engineers. I've had a wonderful career. It's not over yet, but I get excited when I see other people starting their careers because I know how much fun they have in front of them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mark.
Yep. Take care.
I'm Aaron Monker, founder of Pipeline Design and Engineering. If you liked what you heard today, please share the episode. To learn how your team can leverage our team's expertise developing turnkey equipment, custom fixtures, and automated machines, and with product design, visit us at teampipeline.us. Thanks for listening.